Chapter 19 of Anna Karenina, Book 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Cole. Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Constance Garnett. Book 3, Chapter 19. In spite of Vronsky's apparently frivolous life in society, he was a man who hated irregularity. In early youth, in the Corps of Pages, he had experienced the humiliation of a refusal when he had tried, being in difficulties, to borrow money, and since then he had never once put himself in the same position again. In order to keep his affairs in some sort of order, he used about 5 times a year, more or less frequently according to circumstances, to shut himself up alone and put all his affairs into definite shape. This he used to call his day of reckoning, or faire la lessive. On waking up the day after the races, Vronsky put on a white linen coat, and without shaving or taking his bath, he distributed about the table moneys, bills and letters, and set to work. Petritsky, who knew he was ill-tempered on such occasions, on waking up and seeing his comrade at the writing table, quietly dressed and went out without getting in his way. Every man who knows to the minutest details all the complexity of the conditions surrounding him cannot help imagining that the complexity of these conditions and the difficulty of making them clear is something exceptional and personal, peculiar to himself, and never supposes that others are surrounded by just as complicated an array of personal affairs as he is. So indeed it seemed to Vronsky, and not without inward pride, and not without reason, he thought that any other man would long ago have been in difficulties, would have been forced to some dishonourable course, if he had found himself in such a difficult position. But Vronsky felt that now especially it was essential for him to clear up and define his position, if he were to avoid getting into difficulties. What Vronsky attacked first as being the easiest was his pecuniary position. Writing out on notepaper in his minute hand all that he owed, he added up the amount and found that his debts amounted to 17,000 and some odd hundreds, which he left out for the sake of clearness. Reckoning up his money and his bank book, he found that he had left 1,800 roubles, and nothing coming in before the new year. Reckoning over again his list of debts, Vronsky copied it, dividing it into 3 classes. In the first class he put the debts which he would have to pay at once, or for which he must in any case have the money ready, so that on demand for payment there could not be a moment's delay in paying. Such debts amounted to about 4,000, 1,500 for a horse, and 2,500 as surety for a young comrade, Vinovsky, who had lost that sum to a card sharper in Vronsky's presence. Vronsky had wanted to pay the money at the time, he had that amount then, but Vinovsky and Yashvin had insisted that they would pay and not Vronsky, who had not played. That was so far well, but Vronsky knew that in this dirty business, though his only share in it was undertaking by word of mouth to be surety for Vinovsky, it was absolutely necessary for him to have the 2,500 roubles, so as to be able to fling it at the swindler and have no more words with him. And so for this first and most important division he must have 4,000 roubles. The second class, 8,000 roubles, consisted of less important debts. These were principally accounts owing in connection with his racehorses, to the purveyor of oats and hay, the English saddler, and so on. He would have to pay some 2,000 roubles on these debts too, in order to be quite free from anxiety. The last class of debts, to shops, to hotels, to his tailor, were such as need not be considered. so that he needed at least 6,000 roubles for current expenses, and he only had 1,800. For a man with 100,000 roubles of income, which was what every one fixed as Vronsky's income, such debts, one would suppose, could hardly be embarrassing. But the fact was that he was far from having 100,000. His father's immense property, which alone yielded a yearly income of 200,000, was left undivided between the brothers. At the time when the elder brother, with a mass of debts, married Princess Varya Tverskova, the daughter of a Decembrist without any fortune whatever, Alexey had given up to his elder brother almost the whole income from his father's estate, reserving for himself only 25,000 a year from it. Alexey had said at the time to his brother that that sum would be sufficient for him until he married, which he probably never would do. And his brother, who was in command of one of the most expensive regiments, and was only just married, could not decline the gift. His mother, who had her own separate property, had allowed Alexey every year 20,000 in addition to the 25,000 he had reserved, and Alexey had spent it all. Of late his mother, incensed with him on account of his love affair and his leaving Moscow, had given up sending him the money, and in consequence of this Vronsky, who had been in the habit of living on the scale of 45,000 a year, having only received 20,000 that year, found himself now in difficulties. To get out of these difficulties he could not apply to his mother for money. Her last letter, which he had received the day before, had particularly exasperated him by the hints in it that she was quite ready to help him to succeed in the world and in the army, but not to lead a life which was a scandal to all good society. His mother's attempt to buy him stung him to the quick, and made him feel colder than ever to her. But he could not draw back from the generous word when it was once uttered, even though he felt now, vaguely foreseeing certain eventualities in his intrigue with Madame Karenina, that this generous word had been spoken thoughtlessly, and that even though he were not married he might need all the 100,000 of income. But it was impossible to draw back. He had only to recall his brother's wife, to remember how that sweet delightful Varya sought at every convenient opportunity to remind him that she remembered his generosity and appreciated it, to grasp the impossibility of taking back his gift. It was as impossible as beating a woman, stealing or lying. One thing only could and ought to be done, and Vronsky determined upon it without an instant's hesitation: to borrow money from a money-lender, 10,000 roubles, a proceeding which presented no difficulty, to cut down his expenses generally, and to sell his racehorses. Resolving on this, he promptly wrote a note to Rolandak, who had more than once sent to him with offers to buy the horses from him. Then he sent for the Englishman and the money-lender, and divided what money he had according to the accounts he intended to pay. Having finished this business, he wrote a cold and cutting answer to his mother. Then he took out of his notebook 3 notes of Anna's, read them again, burned them, and remembering their conversation on the previous day, he sank into meditation. End of chapter 19. Recording by David Cole, Medway, Massachusetts.